I do think coming here gave me a lot of exposure and I learned a lot. But over time, I also realized that I was also teaching people a lot. So it wasn't just me coming and learning and being a consumer of the information. Like I was also a creator of knowledge.
Bonjour! Welcome to White Walls! My name is Mathieu Penaud. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, passionate about the role of design and technology in education and learning. In this podcast, I interview inspiring educators, researchers, designers, and innovators to discuss their journey and insights as they imagine and build the future of learning. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite episode with fellow parents and educators, and make sure you don't miss our next guest by following White Walls on your favorite podcast platform, or even better, by subscribing to White Walls' free newsletter on Substack. Thank you for being part of the conversation, and now, your episode. Today, I am excited to welcome a good friend of mine and a brilliant product researcher in the higher education space, Sedinam Worlanyo. Sedi is a senior UX researcher at Coursera, focusing on learner experience as well as international expansion efforts, making learning accessible to everyone across the globe. Sedi also leads the Coursera for Africa initiative, aimed at nurturing young talent across Africa and serving as a connector for partnerships within Coursera and organizations based in Africa. I encourage everyone to check Sedi's LinkedIn newsletter called Skills Scratchpad, where she shares personal insights to make user experience, or UX, research more approachable to people who may be interested but feel intimidated by this type of role. Today, we will discuss Sedi's experience at Coursera as a UX researcher, reflecting on best practices and the evolution of this role in the EdTech industry, before expanding the conversation towards her vision of the EdTech ecosystem in Ghana and in Africa more broadly. Sedi, thank you so much for joining us on White Walls. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. That was a beautiful introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you. Excited to
Only
be here.
beautiful because of all the things that you've been working on.
Thank you.
Awesome. Let's start with some rapid fire questions, and the goal is for you to answer the first thing that comes to your head. And if there's things you want to elaborate on, feel free to do so.
Okay, sounds good. I'm ready.
So my first question is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Ghana, in the capital, Accra specifically. Yeah, I can elaborate on that if you need me to. But yes, definitely a lot of colorful dancing, music, family. Those are the words that come to mind when I think of growing up in Ghana.
Awesome. And where do you live now?
Currently, I live in San Francisco in California.
So you mentioned a few things that kind of relates to your childhood or how you think of Ghana. What would be your first memory as a child?
Oh, that's a good one. First memory as a child. I don't know. My birthday is coming up, so my birthdays are birthdays. What's coming up for me right now? But essentially, as a child, I remember we would be in classroom in the class, and then you would invite your friends. You would buy a cake. You would bring all the different people to just come and feast together, and then the class would collectively sing "Happy Birthday" to you. And even at a younger age, I do think it was an example of just community vibrance. And it's something that I'm looking forward to here as well, because, yeah, as part of my birthday, I'm also going to be bringing people together to celebrate in a way that's meaningful to me.
Awesome. And talking about school, who was your favorite teacher?
Oh, my favorite teacher. I have so many and different phases of my life. The person that comes to mind currently is my undergrad professor, computer science. He was my introduction to computer science professor. His name was Jeffrey Nair from Swarthmore College. So shout out, Jeff, if you ever listen to this. But I think why he was my favorite is he was super intentional and patient, especially when I was thinking through some computer science concepts that at the time were felt super intimidating. He would take his time and break it down in a way that I was able to understand. And I do think a large part of me continuing to decide to have a computer science major in undergrad was also because of his encouragements and how he taught me my introduction to computer science class.
Cool, thank you. What is one thing that every child should learn at school?
Uh, okay, the first thing that came to mind was dance, which is, I mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily, yeah, the direction I think I'd have went, but it's what came to mind because I do think it captures different skills that people don't necessarily think about. I think outside of even just like your physical coordination, physical wellness, and also well-being that comes from exercise, there's also just the discipline of like training or learning a choreography. um, if you're dancing in a group, paying attention to how other people in your team are dancing, making sure you're all coordinated, collaborating together. So I feel like even in my life today, dance is still a huge part of how I spend my time, and it's something that is a great skill that teaches you different skills. So yes, dance. I would say dance.
I love that answer. It's the first time we got this one, and I love it.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm like, I wonder what other people. But yes, that's what came to mind.
What is one thing that every adult should learn at work?
A huge part of my work today is how do you interact with other people? How do you build those relationships? How do you communicate to different stakeholders in a way that they're able to understand the message you're trying to drive home? So, one of the key skills I think is just communicating and navigating stakeholders. I think it's an important skill that, regardless of whatever your career path is, people, when there are more than two people, you have to know how to work with them. So that's a skill I think everybody needs to learn. It's like, one, how do you cultivate the relationships you need to do, and then how do you communicate with different people to get things done in a company.
That makes sense. What was your first impression when you moved to the US?
Well, these rapid fire questions. I can't think of a single impression. I just remember all the emotions and feelings that came with moving into a new country, meeting different people who were also moving into a new country for the first time, and then having to navigate building like a new community where I was.
Hmm.
So those are the emotions, those are the feelings that come up for me when I think of first impression, but not like a single one.
Oh, that's nice. It's funny because I think the thing I would answer is cold
Oh.
because San Francisco is where I landed for the first time in the US, and I was expecting California to be warm, but San
Mm,
Francisco is cold a lot
yeah,
of the time, and I remember that was my very first impression.
I agree. I
That's
agree.
funny. Last two questions. What is the latest thing you did for work?
I'm currently working on a research project as part of my role as a UX researcher. That's the most recent thing that comes to mind, where I'm working on synthesizing some of that information and trying to figure out what are the connecting dots so that I can communicate it to my stakeholders effectively. So that's where, yeah, in terms of latest project, that's what's happening in the pipeline for now.
Cool. And what is the latest thing you did to relax?
Ooh, a walk. I would say the beauty of living in San Francisco, specifically around where I am, is the being close to the Golden Gate Park. So I really enjoy just stepping out, going for long walks, and thinking, just breathing in the San Francisco air, saying hi to all the dogs that I see on the way. But yes, that's something that I find very relaxing. Just walking in parks.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Thanks, Matthew. They were good. Good questions.
Oh, thank you. And now let's get into the main part of this conversation. And I'm going to start with the question that I ask to every guest. How do you feel when you reflect on your journey from where you started to where you are now?
When I think about my journey from where I started to where I am now, the whole idea of evolution, growth, unlocking different levels in my career, that's something that comes to mind for me. Like I mentioned, I grew up in Ghana, and from my time in Ghana, I was able to attend a Pan African boarding school called SOS, which was a Pan African boarding school, which meant you were meeting people from different parts of the continent. one year my roommate is from Zanzibar, next year my roommate is from Ethiopia. And that really cultivated my perspective on life. I think growing up, I knew my world was bigger than Ghana. And it's because of that exposure at a very young age to just different cultures. How that evolved was then I moved to the US where I was doing undergrad at Swarthmore College. In that same way, I was very actively involved in international organizations. So whether I was an orientation leader for international students or the head of our Swarthmore African Students Association, yeah, I've always been excited by different cultures, learning about people, where they come from. And fast forward even to now, where my work is user experience research, and I'm speaking to learners again, literally across the globe. It's always mind blowing to me how I can be on Zoom and then I'm like, oh, I just talked to someone in Dubai or I just talked to someone literally across the globe, and you're learning a lot about their experiences, their needs, their stories, and how we can improve education. So it's a whole. When I think of my journey from then till now, I do think I see that the thread of the things I care about, the things I'm passionate about, whether it's been education, stories from different people, different cultures, and I also see how I've become confident in my skills across the way as well.
Yeah, and I love yeah how you talk about that connection with like the world and how that was one of your main thread through your career
Yeah.
in your life. One thing you said that's very interesting is yeah, we don't sometimes we don't or like we take for granted how easy it is now to talk with someone on the other side of the globe, and that's pretty recent. Like that's not something that we used to do a lot. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to take a step back and reflect on what it means to be able to connect with people in this way.
Yeah,
So super
literally.
interesting, and definitely something we're going to talk about also in this conversation. And I think I want to talk about it a little bit through the lens of like your job. So you're a senior UX researcher at Coursera, and I think most people know Coursera, but just as a reminder, it's this online platform where you can find a lot of classes, like courses that are taught by professors from universities around the world. But how would you describe your role today at Coursera?
When I think about my role today, I see myself as a strategic thought partner. I'm someone who really gets to spend time with our learners, gets to spend time with people who are teaching and also learning on Coursera. And the beauty of that is you truly expand your view on what's possible because you're understanding, okay, here are the needs, here are the pain points, here are possible ways that we can tackle and like solve for that. And then you're going to the team and working very closely with the team to think through, okay, what's next, so what, like we found these things from our partners, from our learners, how do we act on it in a way that improves overall experience? So in a lot of ways, I really have to be thinking strategically about, okay, what are some of the insights? And then how do we connect the dots to make sure we're solving the right problems as a company?
Mm.
So it's very fun. Like I really enjoy my job. Even talking about it, I'm like, wow, like this, like it's such a cool job when I think about it because you really get to also advocate for learners in a way that, yeah, for people who aren't in the room, how do you make sure that their voices are brought to the forefront of discussions?
Are there specific projects like you want to learn about specific aspect of the product or the user's behaviors, or is it more open-ended and you kind of like try to find some insights from these conversations that then you can bring back to the team?
Yes, good question. More often, it's more scoped where I'm trying to understand specific behaviors, trying to understand how certain behaviors might be influencing some of our metrics, the key things that we think about and wonder about as a company. I do think with the generative AI that has brought kind of a little more room in terms of how you scope research questions because there's so much that we're still learning with generative AI in education. Um, but even with that, we still make sure whatever you're studying, whatever you're learning, is work that will tie in directly to how we're building new products. But yes, when the future is unknown, there's a lot more exploration that I think comes in with research, which I've also been enjoying.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about the role of generative AI in research, because I think that it does have an impact and definitely will have a lot of impact in the future. So I'm very
Definitely.
interested about learning from you and your vision on that. But going back a little more on like user research, when you conduct this research, and I think specifically when you work on international research, what are some of like the main challenges that you encounter?
When I think of international research specifically, it depends on the nature of the project. So there are certain studies, for example, where if, for example, I'm trying to understand multilingual learners, we have people who are learning from everywhere, whether it's they're learning in Arabic or learning in Spanish. And depending on the methodology I'm using to understand the problem at hand, a lot of time I'm also spending time trying to understand specific norms for who I'm about to talk to. It's kind of it's actually tied back to the thing we said about international, yeah, just even in my work in terms of connecting with people with different backgrounds, because what happens is you really have to make sure you're studying your audience so you know how to show up in an interview in a way that's thoughtful and in a way that you can learn authentically from the person you're speaking to.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't call it a challenge, but I do think that there is definitely a lot of intentionality with international research, intentionality about understanding, okay, who are you about to do research on? How can you make sure that you're showing up fully and respectfully in the space to whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like concretely, how do you learn about the specificities of like those audiences and be
Yeah,
ready like to show up in that way?
definitely. I think you definitely there's a lot of being resourceful. For some of my interviews, I have yeah, I've either contacted our internal customer success team that I know works with those customers on a regular basis or works with those learners on a regular basis, and then I ask them questions. I do the interview before the interview where it's like you're learning from them. There's also even specific books. There's one book I wanted to recommend, but it's the title is jumping off my mind, but my manager actually recommended it to me when I was doing one of these international research studies. But it was around meeting norms in different cultures and how that looks like or how that shifts based on who you're speaking to. For example, there are some cultures where it's okay to be like very loud and even in how you're talking, very expressive, super expressive. There are like other cultures where that might be different. Even like video, people might not turn their videos on for a specific reason. So there's just all these different nuances that I over time have tried to learn, but also with the understanding that even though that's the perception of whatever the culture is, it's possible that whoever you're speaking to might deviate from that.
Hmm.
So even you do all that research and then you get into the interview and you're still you're still learning from whatever is about to happen in the interview and just also asking questions. So yeah, I found that my curiosity goes a long way, especially in those settings, because you just ask questions. You ask questions before, you ask questions during, and that helps how you engage with your audience or whoever your research participant might be.
Yeah, and I imagine you build also that flexibility, like that you're able to adapt during the interview to
Yeah,
match like the person you're interviewing.
exactly, a
Yeah,
1000%. Yeah.
yeah. And do you have example of maybe an interview, so without giving the details, obviously, but an interview where you felt you came in like prepared and it really didn't go like the way you expected, and kind of like what did you do also like in that situation?
Um. Okay, so I was conducting a study where, in my recruitment, I thought the person I was about to speak to was more bilingual, and then I realized that they spoke yeah, a completely different language. But then I had already entered the interview. So I enter the interview, I'm speaking in English, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand English." So I actually ended up using Google Translate,
Wow.
where for the first couple of minutes, I really had to lean heavily on them, like screen sharing, showing me their different experiences. And then I would ask a question, hope they understood. But I do think they did understand because they ended up just, yeah, it was really interesting because what I needed was to see their behaviors and how they're flowing through different pages.
Mhm.
So that was one where if I had been better prepared and informed, I would have brought along a translator into the interview so that we could have a more seamless conversation. But for this one, I was scrambling a bit where I was like, okay, we're talking. Let me just make sure I understand what you're saying, translate it back to you. But I was actually very impressed because we didn't do the full hour interview, but we had a good 30-minute interview where I was able to leave with, okay, this is, yeah, with certain answers that I needed to understand.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. Actually, it makes me think of generative AI. Maybe that's not going to be the first time we talk about it,
Mhm.
because you talk about having a translator when like the other person does not speak English. Um, what do you think about generative AI potentially having that real-time translation ability versus having a translator? Like, do you think it will be able to, like, do you think there's value still in having a translator versus using a automated tool, or that will be enough for the kind of UX research that you're doing?
I mean, I've seen there are different tools out there that are trying to experiment in the translation space. I do think there are pros and cons because with generative AI, currently where it's at, it's not always consistent.
Hmm.
And that's something that I've seen even just using some of these tools. So I mean, there is a risk of being in an interview and then it translating it in a way that doesn't take into account the context, the tone, the nuances versus a human being who might have that understanding of the language and just more
Yeah.
additional context. So I see the pros of efficiency. So I that's the thing. So I do see the pros and cons. But where it's at today, depending on the language, actually, I will also say there's certain languages that I've seen generative AI do very well. And I do think it's because it has access to more training data for those languages.
Hmm.
So I would have to weigh all those things into consideration.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. But what's your experience? I mean, even though I know you are interviewing, I'm curious because with French and generative AI, I don't know if you've seen any translations or how do you think it's been faring?
Yeah, I feel that as long as you're not talking about something very technical or that where there's like terms that are ambiguous or that carry a lot of meaning or weight,
Yeah, yeah.
I feel it would be good enough. But I think my biggest challenge with it is that it creates a barrier, like a wall between you and the person, because you're going through that third
Mm,
party that is not human. Like if you have a translator, you're still going through a human, but because you're going through that computer's translation, you don't build that same rapport, I think, with the person that you're talking to.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Even like if
mm-hmm.
you don't speak the language very well, but the example you shared, you still try, you show that effort to try to communicate, and I think that also plays a role in the way the person is going to respond, and they
Yeah.
might be like maybe more honest or more open to sharing what they want to share
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
when there's a
mm-hmm.
translator in between. I think it might lead to people feeling more comfortable like not saying exactly what they want to say because anyway it's going to go through a translation, or I don't know, I think it might affect the answers that we're going to get. So
Yeah, the
probably
dynamic.
something to observe and measure.
I agree with you. It's interesting. Also, can I just say that as a researcher, I'm holding my. There's so many questions I would ask you back, but I'm I'm refraining and trying to be a good participant.
If you want an example of one interview that did not go well, though, I can give you one that was very fun.
Yeah.
That's an experience that I had with in my previous job actually. And I was doing some interviews for research, and there's one participant that sounded very weird. Like everything was very general.
Mm,
There was kind of a sense of I'm not sure if that's a person that's doing the job that we're looking for. But we did the whole 1 hour,
okay.
and it turns out that in that same project, like 2 weeks later, we do some more interviews, and like a person comes up with the same voice. It was a very distinctive, like high pitched voice, and we had the video. The person literally drew a mustache with a marker and was pretending to be another person, and that
Oh
was
my
literally the same person,
goodness.
like same voice and everything. And we're like, what?
That's so bizarre.
So, obviously we did not pursue with the interview, but unfortunately that's one of the challenges that you might get, is like evaluating whether the person you're interviewing is legit, and then can you use that data you got from the interview in your research.
Exactly. The recruitment piece. But I mean, props. Person drawing on a mustache is a.
That was hilarious. That was hilarious. But yeah, and actually you do share. So that's like typically like recruiting is one aspect of UX research, synthesizing data, which you said that's what you're doing right now for the project you're working on, is another part. Interviewing is another part. And I know that for people who are interested in these type of roles, it can feel like intimidating because there's a lot of new skills to learn. There's a lot of interaction with other individuals, and you've created a newsletter called Skills Scratchpad to share tips and insights about like UX research so that you can break it down and make it more accessible. What was the motivation behind it?
I think it was a culmination of different things I have observed in my life. For me, for example, in one of my first jobs outside of college, I was working with an educational technology company that was based in DC. And as part of my job there, I was also doing instructional design, but there were some elements of user experience research that I was doing. But at the time, I did not know it was called user experience research. So I feel like until after tech change, after my first role, I then went to Stanford, where I met you, Matthew. But yes, we were doing the
Yay.
program, learning design technology program together. And I was also just doing work through the design school and also connecting with previous alumni of the program, that I started learning the language of user experience research. I was like, oh, they're like aspects. This is what it actually is. This is what it looks like. So it's I found out that from that experience, I found out that there are some roles that exist today that have labels or have titles, and if you look at those titles alone, you might be like, oh my gosh, prompt engineering, I could never do that. But then when you actually break it down, you're like, oh wait, actually maybe there's some aspects that I currently already know about or that I already do that I can transfer over to this, and I'm not starting from scratch. So that was the motivation for Skills Scratchpad. It was, how do you really take concepts, topics in user experience research or other areas of interest, and how do you break them down in a way that's accessible to people so that they realize that they're not starting from scratch. They're like certain skills that they might be able to transfer or connect the dots with. So yeah, I try and be consistent with publishing and really try and look and analyze the work that I'm doing and pull out some of those words that might sound fancy, like synthesizing or like what is it, and try and
Mhm.
really shed light on what it actually looks like so that people understand and can connect some of the
Yeah.
dots there.
Yeah, that's super helpful, I think. And so I'll put the link of like to the newsletter in the details of the episode so people
Oh,
can
thank
check it
you.
out.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to do, and for all types of jobs, because it feels like now we have information everywhere, but it can be an overload of information, and having someone who can like bring it to a lower level and make it like easier to enter and lower the floor basically is super important.
Mm.
And I know a lot of people who are interested in UX research. What would be your advice for someone who is interested in like starting a career, like doing a career change and moving into user research, for example?
I would probably tell them, oddly enough, I was about to say to do their research, but yes, I do think a part of it is literally speaking, trying to reach out. I remember when I had just finished my undergrad and I was trying to figure out whether to continue pursuing software engineering or go into a different field. The advice I got from one of my mentors was to try and reach out to as many people in some of the careers I was interested in, and then just learn like what does their day-to-day actually look like. What
Mm,
are some things they love about their role, what are some things that they actually would procrastinate on for days. And I feel like even that experience, I did have the privilege of having a mentor who could connect me, especially for people who I didn't know. But then there were also some people who through LinkedIn I just found them, cold reached out. And I definitely feel like there's value in just even demystifying the job for yourself and understanding how it looks like in different contexts, so that for you, you can also then decide and picture, actually, do I want to be in this space? Or what does that look like?
mm,
But I also recognize that if you're someone who, because I don't necessarily think it's also a time thing,
mhm.
right? Kind of that advice comes on, okay, you have time, you have connections or the network. So yeah, I'm putting that caveat there that there is a privilege associated to be able to do those things, and it's something that I found valuable.
Yeah, that's very true. Another thing I wanted to talk about is since you do research at Coursera, which that has like such a huge reach and is at the forefront of like higher education. I'm curious, what are some of the trends that you see in terms of what people want to learn or like how they learn? What are some things that you've seen evolved?
I would say one of the biggest topics now that even like our CEO, Jeff, has been talking about in different conferences more recently has been generative AI in education. So it's really thinking about the idea of how do you personalize learning in a way that before we might not have been able to do at the scale that we are now. So there are different tools, whether that's I know you've heard of like different AI tutors or AI ways to like build different courses. There are different use cases and functionalities that our teams have been exploring that we've shared more widely on like Coursera blog. But yes, so trends. I would say the key trend I'm seeing is really how in education, how do you create a personalized experience where learners are able to more easily discover courses, learners are more able to get unstuck when they're stuck in a course and they need, support.
Mhm.
How are they able to get that support in a way that's accessible, even if there's no human in the loop there currently?
Yeah.
So, mhm.
And in terms of you're talking about generative AI, in terms of the role of researcher, what impact do you see generative AI having?
As a researcher, one of the ways I've used it, funny enough, is to teach. So my skill scratch pad, I was able to use it, for example, to develop an aspect of an example of a research plan. And then based on my knowledge of research, I was able to kind of layer on, okay, well, here's what here's what I would change, here's how you could improve this, or here's how I was thinking about this, here's why. So it's been an interesting, just a valuable resource to even
Hmm.
generate examples, especially my job where you're not allowed to share the things that you're working on, because a lot of it is confidential. It's how do you generate templates or examples for people within research to understand, when I say research plan, what am I talking about? When I say
Hmm.
research protocol, what am I talking about? And then how can we break it down further?
I can see that. You also see like how when you're talking about like preparing for certain interviews, like learning about the context that might be maybe helpful too. I imagine not
That
so
one,
much.
I don't know about that, because I feel like, well, I don't know, possibly it's possible. This is something that I might need to investigate further, but I haven't necessarily seen it do well with larger contexts. For example, I wanted to be able to use Meta AI to visualize an outfit, and specifically, I wanted to visualize a kente outfit, and kente is a cloth, a very regal royal cloth that we use in Ghana, royal fabric. So I was like, okay, Meta AI, here's the context, here's what we need. Let's generate a kente outfit that does XYZ. But obviously, it doesn't know not obviously, but I didn't necessarily know what kente was,
Hmm.
right? So there was some work in terms of describing, and I do think that is just sometimes in different cultures and different contexts, the data that you would need to train the model maybe does not exist yet, like
Mm,
online, or wasn't used as part of that training data to be able to make the AI understand those contexts or cultures like as well.
yeah.
So that's the thing I wonder about when I kind of reacted in that way, where I've tested it out with certain things, at least from Ghana, where I'm like, okay, it has no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah, and I wanna spend some time also talking a bit more about Ghana and Africa in general because that comes up a lot in the work that you do.
Yes, yes,
Maybe you
yes.
can tell
Sure.
us a little more why. And I know you explained at the beginning, that kind of connection you have. So why do you work so much with Ghana, Africa, and how?
Definitely. So yes, I mean Ghana is home for me. It's where I grew up. And I just see so much potential in terms of talent. How do you connect talent across Africa with opportunities, economic opportunities? That's why it's come up for me recently, especially because currently my day-to-day job is working for an educational technology company where we think a lot about not only how do you provide the education, but it's also how do you make sure you're positioning people so you're connecting them to jobs and economic opportunities that will
Hmm.
help them improve their lives. And for me, every time I'm home, I encounter there are like certain people who I meet who I know they're like the most talented, super brilliant. And I definitely know that a lot of where I am now is was through the privilege of being able to get the scholarship to go to Swarthmore, get the opportunity to work at Tech Change, go to Stanford. Like all of these were doors that I was able to gain access to because of some of these doors that were open for me and opportunities that were open to me. So I do think about two things. One, it's like for people that with where the workforce across the continent is going, if you look at the statistics of how the young population is growing across Africa, definitely how do you create opportunities for young people coming up is something that I wonder about and think about and try and do through even our work that we do at Coursera. And then the second piece is I think it took me a while. A lot of times when we come, okay, let me speak for myself, but coming to the US, I did I came a little, is the word like bright eyed, where you're like, oh my gosh, there's like so much out here. There's so much to learn, which was true for me. I do think coming here gave me a lot of exposure and I learned a lot. But over time, I also realized that I was also teaching people a lot. So it wasn't just me coming and learning and being a consumer of the information. Like I was also a creator of knowledge, whether it was like,
Hmm.
oh, well, in Ghana, here's what I learned by doing bank. Or I listened to my grandma who would tell me all these stories. And I didn't even realize how much I'd picked up in terms of being able to tell stories by that, what people wouldn't necessarily call education, but was education for me. So that's also another problem I'm thinking about now, where it's how do you, within Ghana, there's so every time I'm going, I'm like walking around, whether it's like buying fabric from someone in the markets or anything else, there are certain skills, certain things I see where I'm like, oh, this is knowledge that people might not necessarily look at you and be like, oh, you're the expert at this, but it's knowledge that can be taught and people can learn from in a certain way. Anyways, so complex way of saying definitely a space I think about a lot. And I'm open to discussing with anyone who is interested in work on the ground in Ghana or across Africa.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. And about like the edtech space and also more broadly like the entrepreneurial space in Ghana, what do you see is the dynamic when they create edtech company startups initiatives in Ghana? Is it with the intention to serve Ghana's population, or is it with already the intention to like be a global solution?
There is a statistic, I need to find it, but I believe it was by the World Bank, that talks about the rise of entrepreneurship in Ghana, specifically of women, of Ghanaian women. And even when I look at my own context of my mother or my grandmother, when I tell you, I just feel like entrepreneurship is in our DNA. Because I just there's something about seeing a problem and then instantly trying to figure out, "Oh, okay, how do we solve that, and how can we solve that in a way that is bringing sustenance and supports to your community?" And it's something that my grandmother did, whether it was she had like her own chair business while she was also minister of parliament in her village that she was in. There were just so many aspects where I got to see that entrepreneurial hat on, and I definitely feel like that's why I also even have the current outlook I do. So I'll find the stats. I can't find the stat right now, but in terms of entrepreneurship, I just see it so much that that's something that exists today in Ghana.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think the opportunities for jobs are limited within the country, it also does it's a forcing mechanism to really think about how can you create your own jobs.
Yeah.
And that's also an aspect of entrepreneurship that I've seen, whether it's people doing their own events company, restaurants, all of that is also fueled by that. The second piece around EdTech companies, locally or more globally, I do think usually as a company, when you think about revenue or profit you're trying to generate, there's also an aspect of scale. So it's why sometimes when people are looking at where they want to invest or places they want to do businesses, they're looking at places with large populations because it also just adds up in terms of, okay, how much money you can get from
Yeah.
those spaces. So when I talk to people, or if I was talking to someone who was considering making or even for myself, actually, let me talk for myself. If I talk to myself and I was advising myself on how to think about starting a business in Ghana, I would, yeah, I would definitely look globally, because I think I would probably try and pilot it first in a smaller market to see, okay, how are people responding to this, but with the mentality and vision that this is not the stopping point. It can only
Mm.
like become bigger,
Yeah.
especially if I want to build a sustainable business.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm going to explain a little more about where that question came from. Having lived like in France, in Singapore, in the US,
Hmm.
like typically these are three places where entrepreneurs have a very different approach in who they're building their companies. Are like startups, more like in entrepreneurial space, like for like in the US, you build for the US, and then eventually it might go global. But like initially you build for the US because that's a big enough market. In France, you build for France, and eventually you look at Europe, and it's kind of
Mm,
like first step is France, but you kind of spend some time building just for France.
yeah.
It's kind of the initial one, and then you may explore Europe, and then maybe you may explore the US, but it's much more complicated. It's a very different market. In Singapore is so small that you immediately think global. Like you think either like Asia or like really like global or US market. But like from the beginning, from the moment you start your company, you're not thinking, oh, I'm gonna address the Singaporean market because it's too small. And so it's kind of like the
Mm,
mentality, like the approach is very different from the get go. So that's kind of where it was coming from. Like, is the mentality more of building from for Ghana first, and then the expansion, is it for Africa or is it for like US? Yeah, how
I
they would approach
see.
that. And I don't know if you have an answer to that, but that's something I'm interested in.
The context. That's interesting. And it's so funny you call out that for US, they build for US, because it's so true.
Yeah.
Just like the mentality. It's interesting to see. I think that's also an observation I've seen. Yeah, I might not be able to speak to the mentality when I think of Ghana. Yeah, I don't think I necessarily have an answer there, but I do have like advice from mentors where it was less of you're building for Ghana and more about how do you think about it was even past Africa, because I think you also find that there are lots of African diaspora that go out. So whether it's in France or in the US, there's Africans all over the world.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't necessarily have an answer yet, but I definitely think because Ghana is a smaller country, it's beyond, it's bigger, it's beyond that. I don't know what that scale looks
Hmm.
like yet, but or what the mentality is generally, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Nice. And I know you've been working on a lot of initiatives and partnerships between like here in the US and organization in Ghana or with the African community. What kind of partnerships and collaborations are more meaningful and can really bring most value on both sides?
I'll talk about an upcoming partnership. This one is driven by a friend, someone I know, and not necessarily me, but I just think it's a brilliant idea. It's called Silicon Exchange, where the whole idea is how do you bring investors, people within the tech ecosystem in Silicon Valley to Kenya, where she's having a conference, and bridge the relationship between investors there, entrepreneurship that's happening in Kenya, for example. And the reason why I think initiatives like that are important, one, you sometimes find that I found that even being working in the US, there's a lot of education that also has to happen with people where, especially with cultures that they aren't necessarily familiar with. So different you might have a stereotype of what you think like Ghana might look like. And yeah, a lot of it is being like, oh, actually, did you know that there were some opportunities here? Or did you know that this is currently being built? Or this is the innovation ecosystem? Or this is something that people came up with. So that kind of education both ways, where it's people within the US learning more about other cultures outside of the US, and also people in Ghana being exposed and learning more about the US. That relationship building is something that I think needs to happen so that when business decisions are being made, there's no like mysterious, oh my
Mm.
God, like, ugh, I don't know what is over there.
Yeah.
There's not that, because it's like, actually, let's break down the walls. Let's connect, get to know me, get to know my stories. And it's why at Coursera specifically, I'm so proud of our Coursera for Africa efforts, where we really think about how do we also facilitate those partnerships. So, for example, this year we were able to host students from the African Leadership University based in Rwanda and Mauritius. They have campuses there. We partnered with them where we had our Coursera Innovation Bridge. They came to campus, they interacted with our communications lead, talent lead. And by the end of the interaction of sharing more about design thinking, having the students share more about the projects they cared about, we're working on. It was just beautiful because by the end of it, not only were the students leaving with something, but the Courserians were also leaving with so much, having
Yeah.
learned from the students. So I want to be able to nurture more of those. How do you just bring people together in a room,
Yeah.
enjoy together, and see your less of the differences, but also more of the similarities that also exist
Yeah.
between both
And
parties.
build that familiarity between cultures and
Exactly. Kind of like, sorry, last thing I'll say on that, because I also think LDT is kind of like that. The fact that we're bringing, because our class specifically was super international.
yeah. So LDT is the program that we were at Stanford. Yeah.
Yes, yes, learning design technology.
Yeah.
And even the fact that you're able to, yeah, I was able to meet you, Ingvi from Iceland, like people from all over the world. And I think that does a good job of giving you more insights and just breaking down walls for certain parts of the world as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. And there's been other LDT friends on the podcast. Renato,
Oh, really?
Clavi, Ingvi were interviewed in the
I
first
love
season.
it.
So yeah, if you want to learn about
Yeah.
their perspective and their work, like I encourage you to look at the first episodes of the first season. Another thing I'm curious about is with Coursera, you have so many learners looking for courses, and I imagine you have some data from like what courses are most popular at the moment, what are like the high level trends, and what people want to learn. Do you have a sense of those trends? I think I'm very interested in that.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm happy to share. Before I do that, I do want to give a plug to our global skills report. Coursera generates that every year, where we actually take that data, break it down into what are specific skills people are learning, what are the courses geographically, how does it differ in like Latin America versus EMEA? Yeah, that's analysis that a team works on. So we'll plug it in for us to check that out. But on a high level, honestly, right now AI is a huge it's a huge drive. So you do see courses like prompt engineering, how people can think about it, how educators can also think about AI. I also have seen project management, I've seen business leadership courses, data analytics. So those are a couple of the higher level, but I will say the global skills report breaks it down in a way that you can actually see the stats like visually for yourself as well.
Awesome. I'll put the link in the details also so people can access it.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sidi. I have one last question that I ask everybody on the podcast before we wrap it up.
Yes.
And that question is, if you could design a school around one thing, what would it be and why? And that one thing can be something physical, can be a concept, it can be anything.
Yeah, an experience comes to mind for me. Um, and that's largely because I also think by learning more about school and education, I realized some of the big things that also contributed to my education were not necessarily within the confines of school specifically. It was, like I mentioned, whether I was like sitting and hearing my grandma tell me stories or talking to my mom about specific things. So yeah, so I define education super broadly because of those experiences. If there was one thing I would design, it's kind of the thing I've been thinking about. It's called hidden teachers. So the idea of hidden teachers is how do you really take certain skills, especially from people who maybe the world might not necessarily look and say that like, oh, these are teachers or famous celebrities. So for example, masterclass has, top chefs or people who they see as experts. I want to experiment with the idea of how do you work alongside people who might be in informal professional spaces, break down some of those skills and yeah, make it digestible in a way that other people can learn from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little vague, but imagine, for example, in Ghana, there's this market, it's called Makola Market. And some of the women I met there are the best negotiators in the world. They're the people who I feel like if I got hired for another role today and I was negotiating, I would want them in my corner, literally, like going back and forth and getting me the salary I need. So it's like, how do you take some of those specific skills and break it down in a way that other people can learn from? I haven't figured out who the audience is yet, but like that problem space is something that I'm very interested in designing a learning experience around.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much for that whole conversation. It was really fun, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for thinking of me. Thanks for making it happen. And thanks for the work that you're doing. Because honestly, when I talk about the stories and the power of showcasing, yeah, just different people, different backgrounds, different careers, all these things also spark someone else listening might listen to this and an idea might spark in a way that's meaningful. So anyways, thanks for the work that you're also doing on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. And where can people find more information about you and your work?
Yes, we can drop my LinkedIn, very easily accessible there. I'd say that's the main place for now, and I'm happy to connect.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teddy.
Thank you. Thanks, Monsieur.
Bye.
Bye.